our next panel, which is the panel on gender and youth in the AFCFTA. And we have one paper that will be presented to us in this session. It is going to be presented by Miracle Okoro, who is an associate at a Pan-African law firm in South Africa called CLG. She obtained an LLM in International Trade and Investment Law in Africa from the University of Pretoria, and her LLB is from the University of Nigeria. Her presentation for us today is Weaving Gender Equity into the Fabric of the AfCFTA, Reflections on the AfCFTA Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade. And this is, of course, a very important topic if we recall that among the objectives of the AfCFTA is the achievement of gender equality, and that gender is specifically mentioned in many of its protocols, for instance, the Protocol on Investment. And even where gender is not specifically mentioned, there are still provisions in several of the agreements or the protocols, for instance, the Protocol on Trade in Goods, that attempt to address some of the barriers that particularly affect women as they attempt to participate in and to benefit from the regional trading system. So Miracle, since you are alone, it means that you don't have to feel rushed, that you can take time with your presentation, obviously not 2 hours. Then we'll open up the floor. We will not use an entire hour and exhaust it on you, but I wish you a wonderful presentation and very fruitful engagement afterwards. Please let's welcome Miracle.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I feel a little more important than I thought. I don't know if I'm supposed to be excited or terrified that I'm the only one on this panel, but it means I get to tell a story about an encounter that I had on Wednesday morning at breakfast. So I'm sitting at the table, I'm having breakfast. I had some appetite at the time. And then 2 people joined me at that table and they're just talking about their work. And I was eavesdropping. Bad behavior, don't do it. But my eavesdrop opened my eyes because I couldn't help but interject and formally asked to join that conversation. What were they talking about? They run an NGO where they work with young women, and they teach these young women in rural communities. Then they are able to give them startup grants to start businesses. So they focus on teenagers and young adults. But they were having an issue. Some of these girls would not start the businesses for the money, with the money that they've been given. And they would have legitimate reasons. They have family challenges. So they're not going to use this grant money that they've gotten to start a business when they have family challenges waiting for them. And it was a humbling conversation for me because as a scholar, as a researcher, as a writer, we're immersed in a world where we're always talking about the theories and how access to finance is a big challenge. But we don't understand how systemic the issues that we're facing are. Because to put on paper to say your recommendation for a problem is we should have more access to finance, you haven't really solved any problem. And so that just sparked thoughts, and the appetite that I had was lost in the moment because I was just very confused about this situation and what exactly we could do. And it got me thinking about my work. And if I had the chance, I would probably trash my paper at that time, but it was too late. He had spent a lot of money to bring me here, my president, so I still had to deliver my paper, but I was distraught by that conversation. So I'm talking about gender equity and the AfCFTA protocols. The reason why this is an important conversation, and I'm glad Barbara already did justice to talking about the challenges that we face, challenges that women face in trade. When we talk about trade liberalization and the challenges that countries face, we think about things in terms of poor countries versus rich countries. The inequalities are clear. There is no argument. But when we start to talk about gender and the inequalities, men and women face, and how men and women do not benefit equally and fairly from the gains of trade, then we begin to have, is that true? How? Trade is gender neutral. So I've had to explain to my male colleagues who are lawyers, and I like to think that lawyers are one of the smart people that I know, and yet they do not see how trade is not gender neutral. So this room is a room full of really smart intellectuals, and Barbara, just layering on Barbara's work and all the conversations we've had in this room about equality, equity, inclusion, I will just get right into the meat of the matter. When it was just 3-4 people in this panel, I would have wanted to skip a lot of these, but I'll just highlight quickly that while looking at my research, I interrogated the trade and gender linkages in international development. I sort of analyzed how trade liberalization opened up this new challenges, because the idea was that trade liberalization is supposed to promote equality, is supposed to promote development, but it also came with challenges. And one of those challenges is that men and women are not benefiting equally from the gains of trade. So I interrogated that concept. I also looked at the gender implications of trade policy. There is an assumption of neutrality with respect to trade policy, because on the face of it, it looks like you're allowed to trade, you're allowed to do business, you're allowed to exchange goods and services. So anybody can do it, men or women can do it. It doesn't matter what gender you have, you can just trade. So stop complaining and trade. That it's that simple on the face of it. But if we begin to interrogate what are the factors responsible for you to, trade successfully, what do you need? You need money, you need technology. Do you have access to all these things? And does gender play a role in your access to these things? So I looked at that. And then I looked at the AfCFTA. The AfCFTA, the agreement itself, and I looked at the protocol. I know it's a draft protocol, but if the AU, any president from the AU in this entire process just lets me know that there's not going to be a lot of difference between the draft as we've seen it now and whatever they would call the final draft. So I went ahead. I've been waiting for 1 year to see what that final draft would be, and I haven't seen it yet. So I just went ahead to look at the draft itself. And a very important question that I raised in my work is, why do we have a combined protocol for women and youth in trade? If you say you want to address the challenges that women are facing in a separate protocol, why are you lumping it together with another group called youth, which would still include men? And then I also analyzed some of the previous attempts by the AU to address the challenges that women face in trade. Have those frameworks or institutions or programs, have they been successful? And if they have not been successful, what is the guarantee that this new thing, this new shiny protocol would also be successful in addressing the challenges that women face? And on that note, yes, I already established negotiations at the Doha round, as we're seeing it, focus on the development agenda, inspired by MDGs, and we have SDGs. We have all that conversation where we see talks around the United Nations UDHR with human rights. So the rights of women, it's not a new conversation. We also have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Then we have the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was a product of the Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995. So we've had global attempts to address challenges that women face with respect to women's economic empowerment. So it's not a new phenomenon in international development. What are the gender implications of trade on policy? The place to start, the foundation for this, is to say very firmly that trade is not gender neutral. Women play roles, both paid and unpaid roles in our society. And when you think about the gender division of labor in the society, it presents itself at a macro level and also manifests at a micro level. So at a macro level, we're looking at what you would call the productive spheres of society, which will naturally gain more attention than the unproductive spheres of society. And it's funny to see that what you would put into the box of the unproductive spheres of society would include the reproductive roles that women play, because it's an unpaid role. And so women who focus on caregiving, and if you don't see how the ripple effects where women are focused on caregiving, raising children, it's a thankless job, it's an unpaid role, but it contributes heavily to the productivity of those members of society. So even though it's regarded as an unproductive sphere of society because that's it does not, you can't quantify it in monetary terms, unlike the productive aspects of society. So that's a conversation at a macro level. But at the micro level, we also see what happens in the home. The allocation of time that women would have to focus on businesses and to focus on growing whatever career path that they choose has implications. You would see that in the division of labor. So even in an unpaid roles, women still contribute to the economy as taxpayers because they would buy and use goods and services. So they are contributing to the economy as taxpayers, they are contributing as consumers, and then you even have women rising up as accidental entrepreneurs, running small businesses with the sole purpose of taking care of their family. These are things that may not, you might not see the role that would play if you're speaking in terms of GDP, but it's very significant in how a society remains functional. So there are key provisions in the AfCFTA protocol for women in trade that I just thought to highlight, to spark some thoughts around how useful that protocol is, or just in assessing how useful that protocol may be. So it starts out with a preamble that re-emphasizes the principles of affirmative action, elimination of discrimination against women in intra-Africa trade activities, and the promotion and attainment of equality for women. These are all nice and fancy words. I'm all for them. Then it talks about the progressive elimination of all non-trade barriers that women face in trade in Article 7. It goes on to talk about how it would ensure the active role of women associations in policy formulation. Excellent provision. Some of the provisions that I have a problem with include provisions that would require that measure that it would talk about would be in accordance with national laws and policies. In a moment, I will explain why I have a problem with this. So it says in Article 11 that there will be an implementation of measures to facilitate access to finance and create funding schemes in accordance with national laws and regulations. Why is this a problem? National laws and policies across the continent, they are not all on the same pedestal. Different countries are different places with their national laws and policies with respect to things that tie into finance. So, for instance, property law, inheritance law, family law, matrimonial causes, they all tie into finance in one way or the other. If you look at the grand scheme of things, these are things that can impact a woman's ability to have access to finance. So, for instance, a country whose property laws and inheritance laws still forbid a woman from owning rights to land, automatically that woman would not be able to have collateral with which she can obtain access to finance, with which she can obtain credit to run her business. And so if those national laws are in place in a country such as that, what would be the measure
to facilitate access to finance in that country that will be in accordance with national laws and regulations in that country. This is ambiguous for me. Because what this means, this requires an overhaul of certain national laws and policies for this to work. Otherwise, you are just reinforcing the existing paradigms. You are not making any real change because the change is structural. The issues are not just on the surface. The issues are deep. It cuts across different areas of law. It cuts across, different cultural and structural barriers being faced across different countries. So what does in accordance with national laws and regulations really mean? Then we also have, I also have issues with how some of the provisions are worded and the language used. So you would see something like state parties shall endeavor to strengthen women's productive capacity by improving technical capacity and ensure access to market intelligence. So typically, maybe my grammar or my English might have some problems, but when I see the word endeavor, it sounds as though you want state parties to try their best. You want state parties to do what they can to make sure they do this. But you've also accompanied that, the prefix before that is the word shall. So is it mandatory or is it not? Do you expect compliance or do you not? To what extent do you want them to comply? Do you want them to take their time to make sure that they do this? Do you want them to drag their feet? Do you want them to just do their best? What degree of compliance are you expecting? And what does this really mean? When state parties read this, do they think they can get away with non-compliance? What are the penalties? What do you expect? Then we also have, elimination and protection of women's rights, of women against harassment in accordance with national laws and regulations. Again, we see this in accordance with national laws and regulations. What does this really mean? This is an ambiguous clause attached to some of the provisions. And I think that if the protocol is going to be effective as a tool for gender equity under the AfCFTA, then we need to be clear on what these definitions are. I used the Barry scale to analyze the AfCFTA's compliance with gender mainstreaming. So if you look at this scale, you see level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. So it's basically telling you how responsive a trade agreement is to gender sensitive issues. What is the gender responsiveness of a trade agreement? So I placed this against the AfCFTA and did that analysis to say, okay, this is where we are. At the time, in the agreement itself, for an agreement that claims to be serious about gender equality, the only place it mentions gender equality in the agreement establishing the AfCFTA is in the key objectives. It sprinkles that as a Cinderella provision, and that's it, takes its hands off it. For a very serious subject matter, we see it in Article 3E and nowhere else. So in different trade agreements, you would find that there might be a mere mention or a mere acknowledgement of the issue. And according to Barry, that would be a level 1. That would be in level 1, where you would say that agreement is limited in terms of gender responsiveness. So you could also see level 2, level 3. With the AfCFTA and with the protocol, we would now have a level 5 because it's supposed to be a legally binding obligation and enforcement, which is supposed to be exciting, except for the ambiguities that I find in the protocol. So I also interrogated the politics of gender mainstreaming in my research because I find that gender mainstreaming is an approach that would bring us to the place of gender equity within the AfCFTA. So with gender mainstreaming, you will find different schools of thought as to how gender mainstreaming should be done. For some people, gender mainstreaming would require that you integrate gender issues from the get-go as a part of the whole, not as something on the side. So from the beginning, when you're designing your framework, gender issues are embedded in it. You're not creating a separate unit, you are enforcing it as part of the whole. That's one school of thought. But there is a school of thought that says that the idea of gender mainstreaming as part of the whole would erase the issues. So we need it as a separate unit so that it's clearly highlighted what the issues are, and women would have a place to go to, and that's your way of enforcing the solutions that you have, because women have their own safe space. So this politics of gender mainstreaming exists. Personally, I find in the course of my work, I took a third position where I'm saying we can do both. That's my position. We can do both. I don't think it has to be one or the other. So we can have a school of thought where, I think that the reason why we're creating separate units is because there's already a failure from the beginning to properly integrate. So while we may not be able to go back to the drawing board afresh to do the needful, because originally the first school of thought would have been a better position for mainstreaming, that when you're designing your framework, you think about gender dimensions from the beginning, but we failed at that already. So we can create separate units as we're having a separate protocol, trying to, as a remedy. So I think this separate protocol is a placebo to solve this challenge that we already have. But while you're doing that, you still have to continue to look at the other dimensions of the whole agreement with a gender lens. That way you're able to maintain both schools of thought while you're ensuring that women have a voice and they're being heard, but you're still incorporating a gender lens in how you analyze issues, whether it's across investment or intellectual property rights or digital trade. You're still looking at those issues through a gender lens. And I think that's important. If you look at trade agreements, usually their way of gender mainstreaming would be to incorporate, some trade agreements would have gender issues maybe as one paragraph in the entire agreement, or maybe in the preamble. So it could be analyzed in terms of location. What part of the agreement would you find gender issues? If it's in the preamble, it shows that this is something that you care about. If you have it, but if it ends there, then that's a problem. If you don't still see it in the body of the work, that's also a problem. So there's an issue of location. What part of the agreement do we find gender issues in the AfCFTAs? Like I said, we have it in the preamble. We have it also as a key objectives, but that's all. So then another issue we analyze is in terms of content. What does the agreement say with respect to these gender issues? The AfCFTA has gone a step further to create a whole new protocol to address these issues, even though I think that's an afterthought, but we can still give them an applause for that afterthought. But I still don't think that it solves the problem holistically. Then what is the scope of the solution that you're providing in terms of whether it's a new protocol, a new chapter? What is the scope? What is the language? These are the considerations to ensure that gender mainstreaming is done right. So the big question that has bugged me from the first day I heard about this protocol: why do we have a combined protocol for women and youth in trade? Do you want to talk about women, or do you want to talk about women and some other people? Do you want to lump in all the groups that you consider vulnerable? And I think that's something that is resulting from the announcement of a protocol for women and youth in trade, is that it has opened a floodgate for people to ask for other protocols. Because now people want protocol for small and medium enterprises. Some people want a protocol for persons living with disabilities. And everyone is right in asking for what they want. So is there a limit to the number of protocols that we want to attach to the AfCFTA? Why are we combining the issues between women and youth together in the same protocol? Women and youth are not homogeneous. They are distinct groups with distinct issues. While you can say, and it's interesting because from time immemorial, we always lump women and children together. And we've excused it with the idea that women are caregivers, they're close to their kids, so if something is wrong with the kid, the woman will be affected, or if something is wrong with the woman, the kids will be affected. So we've accepted that and it's fine, but what's the justification for a women and youth protocol? It's true that they're both vulnerable groups, and it's true that the gains of trade do not reach them in the same way. They are disproportionately affected by trade liberalization. That is true. But it's putting them together in one protocol the answer to this problem. These are issues that I looked at because I find that even though they are both vulnerable groups and they may have similar issues in trade, women still have very specific issues that relate to them in trade that do not present in the same way as the youth. That do not present in the same way as the challenges that the youth have. And I also find, maybe somebody would contest that here, but I find that some of the challenges that the youth will face that impedes in how they are able to trade successfully are issues that can be tackled outside of a protocol for youth in trade. Because, for instance, the challenge of unemployment is a challenge that your national government needs to take care of. And while the AfCFTA's trade liberalization attempt hopes to open up more employment opportunities, a protocol for youth in trade, lumped together with a protocol for women, it just conflates issues. But there are challenges that the protocol can address for women that youth in trade may not necessarily need to. And the person who is supposed to present a paper on the youth in trade is not here, so I'm free to speak as I like and trash the protocol for youth. But anyway, my point is, this protocol is necessary for women, and it's a nice to have for youth in trade. And I'm a youth and I'm a woman, and so I think I'm able to have some more objectivity, towards this issue. So I think it's important that we still, if we're able to separate the issues, then it's clear, because there's in the protocol, there's reference to a committee that will carry out M&E. It's called the Committee on Women and Youth in Trade, that will do monitoring and evaluation. And I imagine how burdened this committee would be, looking at issues that concern women while looking at issues that concern the youth as well. What is the bandwidth of this committee to be effective in carrying out their functions? And that, I think that's a serious problem, seeing as women and youth, they are two very big categories, two very big issues that we need to address. So the AU has made attempts in the past. They've carried out things like the AU Strategy for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, the Solemn Declaration on Gender Equality in Africa, the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the Rights of Women in Africa, the Maputo Protocol, which obligates state parties to adopt and enforce legislative and other measures to guarantee women equal economic opportunities, to create an enabling environment for women to participate in economic activities, including the informal sector of the economy, to establish a system of protection and ensure social insurance for women in the informal sector. And we also have the AU African Women and Youth Financial and Economic Inclusion Initiative 2022 to spur women's participation as producers and traders. Is this an old dog with new tricks? So we've had all these wonderful initiatives in the past that have not succeeded. So if the AU has not ensured the effective implementation of all these frameworks that it has established in the past, what is the guarantee that it's going to be any different with this new protocol? So do we keep bringing out new instruments every time we face a challenge with the existing system that we have? And I conclude with this to say that I do not think that a proposed protocol is an indefatigable evidence of gender equity within the AfCFTA. I think the protocol is a panacea or placebo for the AfCFTA's failure to effectively integrate gender dimensions in the entirety of the agreement. And I think we are facing a multiplicity of instruments under the AU to address issues that relate to women's economic empowerment. So what are the tensions and the opportunities that lie with all these multiple frameworks, all these multiple laws, all these multiple instruments that exist under the AU? And again, I want to say that we need men as allies. We need not continue to have conversations around gender equity in silos. When the AU would want to convene a meeting to discuss gender equity, you would fill the room with women. So we end up we're talking to each other about our problems, you know, and that's interesting and that's okay. But we need the people who have, you know, I had a phrase yesterday that I really love. It's called power calculus. Somebody said that yesterday. I don't know who said that, but I think that's a powerful phrase. So we need people who have some more power calculus to join us in those conversations, because the people who dominate the sectors where we need more access, the people with the finance, with the technology, they're still headed by men, and we can't be having conversations in silos. And I also hope that we have more conversations where we incorporate not just academics, but even conversations that also include practitioners, you know. So now we've done this research, now we're having these conversations. It would be interesting to be seated in fora where we would have more practitioners, more academics, more policymakers, so that we do not have these conversations in silos. Finally, I think that gender mainstreaming under the AfCFTA would require that women are not just accommodated within the existing status quo, but that we challenge the discriminatory status quo completely. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Miracle. I'm sure that all of us were very highly engaged in the presentation that Miracle has just made. That was a very good use of your time. You've now enabled us to have 15 minutes before the next round for a Q&A. So Miracle mentioned to us the peculiar challenges of women in the trading space. She also challenged us with her thoughts on the prudence of combining women and youth in a single protocol, and also challenged us to engage on the level of gender mainstreaming that has been achieved, or that can be achieved, for example, because of the use of the language, best endeavor languages, for instance, in the protocol. So we'll have two rounds of questions. We can have 3 questions each so that you can keep track of the questions. So by show of hands, can I please see the first 3 questions that we'll take? I recognize your hands, sir, from Unisa. Any other questions?
Thorough examination of the problem of gender under the AfCFTA. I was curious to hear your thoughts about what your previous panelist had said regarding constructing the AfCFTA under an intersectional paradigm. You mentioned that you were curious about whether or not we needed protocols for all vulnerable groups. You know, you said, do we need a protocol for disabled people as well? And I mean, I understand intersectionality as an analytical tool, but I don't know how it would work as a policy tool. It seems that if we are if we're saying we need to appreciate, at least as intersectionality says, interlocking systems of power, then the category of woman under the AfCFTA begins to fissure into all these kinds of permutations of identity. So we'd have to talk about disabled women, trans women, and so on and so forth. And I wonder, then does the actual subject of protection under the AfCFTA, being the category of women, begin to lose its meaning once it undergoes all these permutations? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. There's this phrase, I'm just going to abridge it. Let's say, a butterfly flaps its wings in Tokyo can cause a mudslide in Zing. So if you look at it from that dimension, do you have a problem with youth and women being lumped together in the protocol? Or to me it seems, and there's no inherent problem as a matter of principle, but statistics and they realized it goes higher where the women are employed, and women employment goes higher where there are certain cultural perceptions differing by region, and all of this that allows that drives the men to act in certain types of ways. So there's dimensions where this is interconnected, and I feel like necessarily the protocol having both aspects together, is it necessarily a problem as a matter of principle, or is it just that it's been very unconsciously done? They've been thrown together as disregarded aspects of the African trade paradigm. Yes.
Very proud that I'm really proud that Miracle is presenting that as a former student. This is, women as an issue is so important, and it's very simple, really simple. It's a no-brainer. Women constitute 50% of the world's population. Yeah, it's hard. So the fact that it's got to be mainstream is even very frightening. That it's got to be mainstream, but we're there, and it's good that it is actually being canvassed now, at least since '92, and that's so important. Now, many institutions, development institutions, have women, and then sometimes it's lumped with children by default, as it were, and then it's broken up, so you can have a person with disabilities, you can have specifically what's called policies, very clear policies, women policies, safeguard policies on disabled children, so you have child slavery as well, although that has its own right because of slavery being in the category by itself. And at the same time, I like to accentuate that you have women-headed households as well in projects, where you have projects which have women-headed households, and they should not be discounted, because all the more reason one should factor that in. The other flip side is where you have communities where women exist, but they do not have the right to speak up, because the way it's presented from a cultural context, they are prevented from communicating with the other side, and their voices are not heard. And I think that's so important to get to hear their voices. I've seen that in development, where you need to have extra engagement with them to hear the voices of women. And you mentioned about the economic factors. It's again so important when you have a project, for example, carrying water, irrigation water, from the canal to the farmland. It's women who would do that, if they do that, and when they have to have pots of water on their head to carry, that's part of the project cost, the benefit. In fact, that kind of analysis should always be factored in, because they should not be discounted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those that.
Please consider my comment in the framework of academic freedom. And not representative of my views on the issues specifically. Okay, so I want to challenge all of the presenters that have addressed gender issues in the AfIEN, and including your paper. One may even argue that you should even be happy to have a protocol on women, because the scope of the AfIEN doesn't cover women specifically. The scope of the AfIEN, when it was drafted, covers trading goods, trading services, intellectual property, competition policies, and investment. So this is an afterthought. And someone might argue that, well, there are enough provisions in the AfIEN which women can benefit from, and you should be happy to have a specific protocol that addresses women challenges. How will you respond to that specific comment?
Miracle, I just have one question. I recognize what Professor Suresh mentions about cultural, issues in Africa and all that, where women are not allowed to speak. Maybe in some, they're not even allowed, to trade on a larger scale leave the, I'm trying to find the word in English. In Swahili we say mama mboga, say the very small scale traders. And I'm thinking, I understand that the Women and Youth Trade Protocol is really, to give women a voice in this, but nations speak and cities build. So if you're saying that you have a problem with the way it is, right? My issue is, do you think we should take a bottom-up approach towards even perceiving and implementing the protocol as it is? Or do we take a top-down, top-bottom approach? So are we going to first elevate the women so that they can have a voice? And I understand we have a voice, but we're talking about the ones that we've seen, the cultural differences and all that, and they're affecting them. So are we going to elevate them, that is the bottom-up, or we're going to speak to the protocol to speak down? I hope you understand my question. Thank you.
Okay, Miracle?
We finance women as though they're a separate unit. Women just want to be able to trade fairly, making sure that you consider the other dimensions that impact how they do business and how they live and how their world is shaped. So yes, the scope of the AfCFTA does not cover women as you have put it. It covers trade in goods and services, but the people who are supposed to be trading in those goods and services and engaging in everything that the scope of the AfCFTA covers includes women. And so the agreement ought to be favorable to this group. And how you design that framework and the implementation should have a gender-sensitive lens, which is why I said one of the schools of thought with respect to gender mainstreaming is that you integrate gender responsiveness in the holistic view of your framework, and not to attach, you attach a separate unit or a separate instrument as an afterthought. So we thank the AU for thinking of us later, but we would have preferred if they thought of us from the very beginning. And with respect to Faith's question, I think that the more useful thing is that the AfCFTA is forcing countries, not just even with respect to women, but it's forcing countries to put their house in order, things they should have done a long time ago, with respect to standardization, with respect to custom procedures, with respect to trade facilitation. The AfCFTA is now putting an extra pressure on countries to put their house in order. And that trickles down to gender issues as well. It's forcing people to start to think about these perspectives if they want to trade. The ideal thing would have been for countries to put pressure on countries to do what they can to elevate the status of women, to use national laws and policies, use domestic approach rather than using a more regional approach. But that has not been effective in the past. So now we're forced to, I say forced very freely, we're sort of forced to now use that top-bottom approach to address the situation. But the more effective thing is to start at the grassroots, to start at the domestic level, to address these issues one community at a time. But we've not done that effectively in the past. So now we're using that supranational instrument to force the hands of countries to begin to implement these measures in their different countries based on where they are and where their women are.
Oh, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please put our hands together for You did very well in facing this panel alone. I really enjoyed your presentation, from the anecdotes to the research and to the way that you engaged with the audience. Very well done.